I'm going to finish up on the last part of chapter 7, which just kind of reviews the other alternative ways of making carbon, doing carbon fixation, and just kind of an overview of the implications of photosynthesis. Okay, so C3 plants are plants that do carbon fixation in the way that we've already described in class. So that's just when they fix their carbon by taking carbon dioxide and adding it to RuBP using Rubisco, with the enzyme to do that, and then they form a 3-carbon sugar called 3-PGA. So that's the normal process that most plants use. It's very common, and you can see it in like rice and wheat and oats. But the one problem is that when the temperature gets too high and it gets very hot, these plants tend to undergo something called photorespiration. Photorespiration is when you actually have oxygen instead of CO2 combined with RuBP. And so you end up wasting ATP. It consumes ATP, but you're not producing any sugar. So this is kind of the downside when the weather gets too hot. And so there's a couple adaptations that plants have made to kind of accommodate hot weather. One of them is C4 plants. C4 plants, they try to minimize photorespiration. And the way that they do that is they take CO2 and they fix it onto a 4-carbon compound. That's why it's called C4 plants. They keep their stomata mostly closed. And so in order to, the reason why they do that is they don't want a lot of the water to evaporate outside of itself. And so they keep that the stomata mostly closed, but then they have to have a way to trap a lot of CO2. And so there are enzymes inside of C4 plants that have a very high affinity for CO2, so that even though they don't have so much CO2 coming in through the stomata, whatever CO2 they do have come in will stay inside and will be used instead of doing photorespiration. The other adaptation is is used with cam plants. This is also in hot, dry climates. And what they'll do is they'll actually fully close their stomata during the day and only open them at night, so that there's less chance of evaporation of their H2O when they open the stomata. And so in order to do that, they'll actually store the CO2 that they gain from opening their stomata at night. And so they can store that CO2 and they'll use that CO2 during the day, even when their stomata is closed. So they'll still continue to do the Calvin cycle during the day. And common examples would be like cactus, cacti, and pineapples, and kind of like leaves like aloe. Okay, so in terms of a broad overview of photosynthesis, we've talked about how light, there's 2 parts. There's the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. And the light reactions is when we're really trying to form ATP and NADPH. That's the main purpose of the light reactions. And in order to do that, we have light come in and H2O come in, H2O being their source of electrons and light being our source of energy, in order to create these 2 molecules. These will then go into the Calvin cycle, and we're going to fixate our carbon and change this carbon into some kind of sugar compound. There are a lot of purposes for creating sugars. Clearly, plants can create it just as its own food source, so it can use the sugars they create and break them down during cellular respiration to get even more ATP. They can also use the sugars they create as starting material for proteins, for lipids, and for cellulose. So it doesn't just have to be for breaking it down, but it can also be used to make up other macromolecules. And then ultimately, the significance of photosynthesis is not just for plants, but we as humans and almost virtually all other organisms in this world will consume plants as their own food source. So plants really serve as like the foundation for the rest of the food chain. And we don't just use it for fuel, like for food fuel, but we can also use photosynthesis, or the products produced by photosynthesis, for heat, for light, and for fuel. When we can burn it, and like coal is an example of something that is kind of produced by plants, or is like the result of plants being decomposed after millions of years. So the chapter ends with global climate change. This is something that's definitely a growing concern. It kind of comes about through the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect is when there's an increase in the Earth's climate or temperature, and that happens when the solar energy that comes into this Earth is kind of passes through the atmosphere, and it warms up the Earth. And the gases that are in the Earth's atmosphere, like CO2 being one of them, it kind of absorbs some of that extra heat and keeps it contained inside the earth longer, thus warming up the atmosphere. And so this greenhouse effect has been leading to climate change. And in this graph, you can see how temperature has really been escalating since the 1850s, correlating with human behavior and industry. And so, in terms of how this affects plants, you would think that with an increase of CO2, it would increase the plant productivity because CO2 is a reactant for photosynthesis. And that is a true statement, but what has actually been observed is that it especially increases plant productivity of weeds and not for crops and the things that we actually care about. And specifically, there's an example of poison ivy, and there's just been a dramatic jump in poison ivy levels, and also the toxicity of their poisons. So that's just one effect of the greenhouse effect. All right, thanks so much for watching, and that sums up all of photosynthesis.